If you've ever watched the Maritime Legends at 2 a.m., you've seen this footage. A massive battleship rolls onto her side, pauses for a heartbeat, and then obliteration. It's the ultimate stock footage of naval disaster played so often it's become routine. But here's the kicker: almost nobody knows her name. This is HMS Barham. For decades, her death has been used as a backdrop for documentaries that aren't even about her. She's the ghost of the Mediterranean, a Queen Elizabeth-class powerhouse that survived the hell of Jutland, only to be turned into a 5-second clip of war porn. But if you think that explosion is the whole story, you've been looking at a sanitized version of hell. Because for the 862 men trapped on that hull, the blast wasn't the tragedy, it was the mercy. The real horror wasn't just the fire. It was the 20 seconds of vertical, frantic scrambling before the detonator hit, and the months of state-mandated silence that followed. The British government didn't just lose a battleship that day. They tried to delete its existence. We're told she just blew up. Trust me, it was far worse than that. Today we're looking past the grain of the film to find the ship that history forgot, even while watching her die on repeat. To understand why the Barham ended up as a 5-second fireball in the Mediterranean, you have to look at her DNA. In the world of naval warfare, the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships were the gold standard. They were the original super dreadnoughts, the Ferraris of the fleet, designed to be faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than anything else on the water. When the Barham was launched in late 1914, she was a technological marvel. She carried 8 15-inch guns that could hurl a projectile the size of a small car over the horizon with terrifying precision. But here's the thing about being the gold standard: the world doesn't stop evolving just because you've reached the top. As the years rolled by between the Great Wars, the British Admiralty faced a dilemma. Technology was moving at a breakneck pace, and their prized thoroughbreds were starting to show their age. Most of the Queen Elizabeth sisters were sent back to the yard for what you might call extreme makeovers. Ships like the Warspite and the Valiant were practically gutted and rebuilt from the keel up. They got massive new superstructures, reinforced deck armor to protect against plunging fire, and modernized engines. They went into the shipyard as relics of the 1910s and came out as modern 1930s predators. But the Barham She was the sister who got left behind. While her siblings were getting high-tech upgrades, the Barham's 1930s refit was frankly a budget version. They trunked her funnels together to clear up the smoke, modified the bridge a little, and slapped on some anti-torpedo bulges. But beneath that fresh coat of paint, she was still essentially a Great War veteran, trying to survive in a World War II reality. She kept her old heavy superstructure and her original horizontal armor that was never designed to handle the sheer explosive force of modern munitions or the vertical punch of heavy bombers. In the eyes of the Admiralty, she was good enough. She still had those 8 15-inch guns, and in the 1930s, big guns were still the ultimate currency of power. She spent the interwar years doing the boring work, patrolling the Mediterranean, playing riot police in Palestine, and showing the flag. To the public, she looked every bit the invincible queen. But to the engineers who knew her deck plans, she was a glass cannon. By the time 1939 rolled around, the Barham was an old lady asked to run a marathon in a world of sprinters. She was heavier, slower than her trials suggested, and her internal protection was a patchwork of better than nothing. This lack of modernization wasn't just a footnote in a technical manual. It was a ticking time bomb. Every time she sailed into a combat zone, she was gambling. Her sisters had been up-armored to survive the unthinkable, but the Barham was relying on her reputation and a 13-inch armor belt that had been designed before the tank was even a common sight on a battlefield. She was an imperfect queen in a perfect storm. When we look at that footage of her rolling over, we aren't just seeing a ship sink. We're seeing the brutal cost of good enough. The HMS Barham entered the Second World War with the heart of a lion, but the skin of a ghost, a ship whose legendary status was being held together by the courage of her crew rather than the strength of her steel. And in the dark waters of 1941, that wouldn't be enough to save her. If the Barham was a relic, she was a relic with the eyes of a hawk. You see, a ship can have the thickest armor in the world, but in a naval slugfest, it doesn't mean a thing if you can't hit what you're aiming at. And if there was one thing the crew of the Barham knew how to do better than almost anyone else in the Royal Navy, it was putting steel on target with surgical, terrifying precision. This is the part of the story that the 5-second viral clip doesn't show you. It doesn't show you the decades of elite training or the moments where this outdated battleship acted like a championship sniper. Her legend as a sharpshooter was born in the smoke and chaos of the Battle of Jutland in 1916, the largest naval battle of the First World War. Barham was the flagship of the 5th Battle Squadron, a unit of fast battleships that were supposed to be the muscle for the lighter battle cruisers. Due to a series of signaling blunders and miscommunications, the kind of fog of war nonsense that gets men killed, Barham and her sisters found themselves miles out of position when the shooting started. They were late to the party. But when the Barham finally arrived, she didn't just join the fight. She dominated it. Imagine the scene. You're on a German ship, the Von der Tann, over 12 miles away. The horizon is a blur of gray mist and funnel smoke. Suddenly, massive 15-inch shells start raining from the sky. No GPS, no digital computers, just man-powered rangefinders and raw mathematics. Barham found the range almost instantly. One of her shells punched through the Von der Tann's stern, jammed her steering gear, and flooded the ship with 600 tons of water in an instant. She then shifted her fire to the Moltke landing hits that rattled the German ship to its very bones. At Jutland, Barham and her sister Valiant recorded some of the most accurate fire of the entire British fleet. While other ships were missing by miles, Barham was landing straddles and direct hits with a frequency that made the German high seas fleet realize they weren't just fighting a ship. They were fighting a marksman. She took 6 heavy hits in return shells that tore through her superstructure and killed men in her medical bays. But she never stopped firing. She was a brawler who could outthink and outshoot the competition. Fast forward 25 years to the Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941. The world had changed, but the Barham's aim hadn't. In the pitch-black darkness of the Mediterranean night, the British battleships crept up on an Italian cruiser force that had no idea they were there. When the searchlights flicked on, the Barham was ready. At point-blank range, essentially a bar fight with 15-inch guns, she helped obliterate the Italian cruisers Zara and Fiume. In a matter of minutes, sophisticated modern warships were turned into burning hulks of scrap metal. This is the tragedy of her viral DNA. When you watch that explosion, you're seeing a failure. You're seeing a ship at her most vulnerable, her most broken. You aren't seeing the flagship that stood her ground at Jutland. You aren't seeing the ship that Italian sailors feared in the dark. History has a cruel way of editing out the excellence and leaving only the catastrophe. We remember the Barham. For the one time she couldn't defend herself completely, forgetting the dozens of times she was the most dangerous thing on the ocean. She was a ship defined by her precision, her discipline, and her lethality. But in the end, all of those years of hitting the mark were erased by 3 torpedoes and a government that wanted to forget she ever existed. The Barham was a predator. But as we're about to see, even the best predator eventually finds itself in a trap it can't shoot its way out of. November 25th, 1941. The Mediterranean sun was high, and the HMS Barham was doing what she had done for 25 years, patrolling the blue. She wasn't alone. She was flanked by the Queen Elizabeth and the Valiant, a wall of British steel designed to intimidate anything that dared to surface. But the threat wasn't on the horizon this time. It was 400 yards away beneath the waves, and it was moving into an impossible firing position. German Lieutenant Hans Dietrich von Tiesenhausen, commanding U-331, didn't just get lucky, he performed a surgical strike that should have been a suicide mission. He slipped through the destroyer screen so close that his conning tower actually broke the surface just 30 yards from the Valiant. For a heartbeat, the British gunners stared down at the German steel, but it was too late. Von Tiesenhausen had already loosed a spread of 4 torpedoes at point-blank range. This is where the stock footage fails to tell the real story. In the film, you see the ship list and then blow up. But if you were on that deck, those final minutes weren't a movie. They were a frantic, gravity-defying hellscape. When the 3 torpedoes slammed into the Barham's port side, they hit so close together, they functioned as one massive, world-ending punch. This wasn't a slow leak. This was a catastrophic structural failure. Within seconds, not minute-seconds, the Barham was leaning at 40 degrees. Imagine standing in your living room and suddenly the floor becomes a slide. Everything that wasn't bolted down, crates, shelves, furniture, and men began to hurtle toward the port side. And this is the part that is far worse than the explosion itself, for the ship was still alive while she was dying. Her massive steam engines were still churning her propellers, still biting into the water, driving the battleship forward, even as she rolled over. This created a nightmare of physics. As the ship turned turtle, hundreds of sailors scrambled out of hatches and portholes, desperately trying to climb onto the upward curving hull. If you look closely at that grainy film, the one everyone uses for cool war montages, you'll see tiny black dots moving on the side of the ship. Those aren't shadows. Those are human beings. They are running on the barnacle-crusted belly of a 30,000-ton beast, trying to stay on top of a world that won't stop spinning. Some were sliding off the slimy steel and falling directly into the massive, still-spinning propellers that were now rising out of the water like giant meat grinders. Others were clinging to the hull, thinking they had found a moment of safety on the island of the ship's bottom. They were wrong. For about 20 seconds, there was a grotesque silence. A pause where the ship hung in the water upside down, with her crew perched on her belly. They thought the worst was over. They thought they just had to wait for the rescue boats. But beneath their feet, inside the belly of the Queen, a fire was racing through the corridors. The torpedoes had torn a path straight into the 4-inch magazine. From there, the fire didn't just burn. It traveled like a fuse toward the main 15-inch magazine where tons of cordite waited. The men on that hull weren't just on a sinking ship. They were standing on a massive ticking pipe bomb. They had 20 seconds to realize that the steel beneath them was getting hot. 20 seconds to look at the Valiant just a few hundred yards away and realize help wouldn't arrive in time. The explosion wasn't just a naval event. It was the instant vaporization of 862 stories, 862 names, and 862 lives, all while the camera rolled, capturing a tragedy that the world would eventually turn into a background clip for a history documentary. The flash didn't just illuminate the Mediterranean, it erased the Barham. When the fire hit those 15-inch magazines, the resulting explosion was so violent that it defied the laws of naval architecture. One moment, 30,000 tons of steel was a solid, recognizable object. The next, it was a towering pillar of black smoke and incandescent debris. Fragments of the ship, some the size of houses, were hurled hundreds of feet into the air. If you look at the footage, you see the shock wave ripple across the water, a physical bruise on the ocean. But as the smoke cleared and the oily water began to settle over the remains of 862 men, a different kind of machinery started whirring. It wasn't the engine of a ship, but the bureaucratic gears of the British Admiralty in London. This is where the story shifts from a naval tragedy to a cold-blooded, calculated deception. To the Admiralty, the loss of the Barham wasn't just a loss of life. It was a PR disaster they couldn't afford. In late 1941, Britain was reeling. The Mediterranean was becoming a graveyard for the Royal Navy. If the public found out that one of their beloved queens had been vaporized in seconds by a single U-boat, the blow to national morale would have been devastating. So they did the unthinkable. They chose the silence of the grave to protect the morale of the living. The British government officially suppressed all news of the Barham's sinking. For 2 months, the world was led to believe that the ship was still out there patrolling the blue. But the true cruelty of this cover-up wasn't just about tactical secrecy. It was about the families. Imagine being a mother, a wife, or a daughter in a gray, bombed-out London waiting for a letter that would never come. The Admiralty knew these men were dead. They had the film. They had the eyewitness accounts from the Valiant and the Queen Elizabeth. Yet they kept the truth locked in a safe. They allowed families to keep knitting sweaters and writing letters to men who had been vaporized weeks prior. To keep the secret even tighter, they reportedly went as far as to have standardized Christmas cards sent out. Or at the very least, they allowed the mail system to continue the charade, so the Germans wouldn't catch wind of the success of U-331. The families were eventually sent telegrams claiming their loved ones were missing a word that offers a flicker of hope, a hope that is often more painful than the truth. It wasn't until late January 1942, nearly 10 weeks after the ship had vanished, that the public was finally told the truth. By then, the Barham was a memory, and the war had moved on to even darker chapters. The government's excuse was that they didn't want the German commander von Tiesenhausen to know he had succeeded. And it worked. The Germans didn't officially know they had sunk a battleship until the British finally admitted it. But at what cost? This is the far worse part of the Barham's legacy. It's not just the fire or the torpedoes. It's the fact that 862 families were used as pawns in a game of psychological warfare. The Barham didn't just die in the water. She was systematically erased from the present to serve the needs of the future. When we watch that film today, we are watching a crime that was hidden for months. We are watching the exact moment the British government decided that the truth was a luxury they could no longer afford. The footage isn't just a record of a sinking, it's a record of a secret. Today, the HMS Barham exists as a digital ghost. Her final seconds have been sliced, diced, and colorized to fit into everything from big-budget Hollywood movies to low-effort top 10 YouTube clips. She has become the ultimate visual shorthand for Explosion, a piece of nameless history used to sell the spectacle of war without ever having to explain the cost. But as we've seen, the spectacle is the least interesting thing about her. When you look at that footage now, I hope you see more than just a fireball. I hope you see the imperfect queen that stayed behind to fight a modern war with Great War steel. I hope you see the sharpshooter of Jutland, a ship that could drop a 15-inch shell on a moving target from 13 miles away with the grace of a predator. And most importantly, I hope you see the 862 men who weren't just dots on a rolling hull, but sailors who were abandoned by the very government they died for in the name of a wartime secret. The tragedy of the Barham isn't just that she blew up. It's that she was robbed of her identity. She was stripped of her name so that her death could serve as a propaganda shield, and then she was stripped of her humanity so that her death could serve as entertainment. History is full of these viral moments clips that we've seen so many times they've lost their teeth. But every time we skip past the names and the dates to get to the action, we're participating in the same silence that the Admiralty forced on those families back in 1941. We owe it to those 862 souls to remember that the fire was just the end of a much longer, much more heroic, and much more complicated story. If you believe that history is about more than just the explosions, that the stories behind the steel are worth digging for, then you're in the right place. We're here to look past the grain of the film and find the truth that the archives tried to hide. If this deep dive into the real story of the Barham changed the way you look at that famous footage, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We've got a lot more forgotten history to uncover, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. Leave a comment below. Did you know the name of the ship in that clip before today? Let's talk about it. The Barham did more than just explode. She lived, she fought, and she was loved. It's time we remembered her for all of it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.